Before starting this video, I do want to give a thank you to my patrons that support the channel. And if you would like to support the channel, there are some great benefits for you in the link down below. So with that, let's get into today's video. Hey, what's going on YouTube? This is Devin coming back at you with another video today on Pub Stomp MTG. And in this video, I wanted to focus on 10 underrated commanders that came out of this year. So there was over 300 commanders that came out, and there are probably some that slipped through the cracks and you may not be aware of, or you may know them, but you probably weren't interested at the time about them because, of course, there's like about 30 or 40 commanders that are usually released within a set, so of course you may have skipped by of one of these. And so in this video today, I just wanted to highlight some of them. You may know them and you may recognize them, but I feel like personally they do need a little bit more recognition for what they're doing. So of course, in this video, I'm not necessarily doing a top 10 list. I'm doing a just kind of picking and choosing which ones I want to talk about first, mainly because I don't feel like these can be like top 10 like underrated commanders. I feel like they are all underrated in their own unique way. 10 commanders I feel like that just went under the radar, and so let's get started. Alright, so the first commander I do want to talk about is Alinda Azor. So back in March on the Machine, they had the option of having two commanders in one, and I feel like that was a really good concept where they had Alinda and Azor in one commander. And honestly, I feel like a lot of people underlooked this compared to Sardar Jabari, the front-facing commander of that product. The one hindrance, though, is obviously the mana cost. 6 is quite a bit for a commander. I mean, it is an Esper color, so there is that going for it, but it does have great stats of being a flying and ward 2. It has a little protection for itself when it's on the battlefield, just in case somebody has targeted removal, but it does have a great draw ability. Whenever it attacks, you may pay X, white, blue, and a black. If you do, you draw X cards. It does also read, at the beginning of each end step, you may pay 4 life. If you do, create a number of 1/1 black vampire knight creature tokens with lifelink equal to the number of cards you've drawn this turn. So note with that ability by itself, it's at the beginning of each end step, so it does include your end step and your opponent's end step too. So if you wanted to pay that 4 life to put more tokens on the battlefield, you're more than welcome to on each opponent's end step too. I will say this does have the engine to draw cards by itself, so at the beginning of your end step, you have that ability to essentially draw maybe like 3 or 4 cards depending on how much mana you do sink into this. But I will say you are in really good colors as far as drawing cards. White does get a boost as far as drawing cards based off of attacking. Also blue, I mean blue is just really good in general by drawing cards, and black has that ability to pay life to draw cards. So this is really just giving you the benefit of putting a large army on the battlefield based off of the number of cards you draw, and there's a ton of ways you can do so in these color combinations. However, let's move on to my next one with Seran of Shipwright. The Elven Council Precon deck had a lot of good cards that focused on the voting mechanic. I personally am not a big fan of it, but I feel like this does it very well, and I feel like it can make a fun commander game. So it does have Vigilance being a 3/4 body, and it does have Secret Council. Whenever it enters the battlefield or attacks, so it has that giant-like effect where it does ETB, or when it attacks, each player secretly votes for a player, then those votes are revealed. Each player draws a card for each vote they received. Each player who received no votes may put a permanent card from their hand onto the battlefield. So to me, this is pretty interesting. Normally, I'm not a big fan of giving my opponents card draw, but at the end of the day, if you just vote for somebody else and you want to put a big permanent on the battlefield, you could easily do so because a lot of people will be greedy and they will want to vote for themselves. So if you do somehow have that Blightsteel Colossus in your hand and you know everybody's going to try to get card draw out of this option, you can easily just vote for somebody else and then just put a Blightsteel Colossus on the battlefield. It seems pretty ridiculous and fun. I'm all for it. Plus, I will say I do have a patron that does play this deck, and he enjoys it quite a bit too. But I am going to move on to probably the most recent card on this list with Sovereign Okek Owl. For me personally, I like this more in the 99, but I feel like it can be a pretty powerful commander. Definitely more of a overrun on top of the overrun-like effect to give to all your creatures. To be honest, when I was reading this, I had to read it a couple times to make sure I knew what I was getting myself into when building a deck tech around this. So it does have some interesting wording. So it essentially reads, when it does attack, for each creature you control with power greater than that creature's base power, put a number of 1/1 counters on that creature equal to the difference. So basically, if you do have an Anthem on the battlefield, say for example, each creature gets +1/+1 because of that Anthem, you go ahead and you swing in with Sovereign Okek, and when it does trigger, it'll have that ability to put a 1/1 counter on each creature you control. That's all based based off of course, if you just have the Anthem and no other effects on the battlefield. But what's really good about this commander, if you have any sort of pump effects, Anthem effects, or even 1/1 counters on your creatures, they're all going to get even bigger with 1/1 counters on them with this commander, and I feel like it's a great option if you really want to make your creatures even beefier. But I do feel like this is a little underrated. Maybe people just kind of skipped over this because of the weird convoluted text that it does have, or they just had other interesting commanders. But for me personally, this is a great win more commander for sure, buffing up your team even more than what they already are at. So aside from that, I am going to dive into my next one. And I feel like not many people talked about Moira and Tesar. I feel like this is a really good combination with each other. Obviously they got Phyrexianized. I think a lot of people skipped over this with the sheer amount of commanders that came out of March of the Machine. This was in the pre-con product for the Phyrexian deck specifically, but again, this is a very powerful commander that I feel like not a lot of people are taking advantage of. So it does have flying and is a 4/5 body. Whenever you cast a historic spell, return a target non-land permanent from your graveyard to the battlefield. It gains haste, exile it at the beginning of the next end step. If it would leave the battlefield, exile it instead of putting it anywhere else. I think a lot of people skipped over this for the fact that they didn't want to exile their permanent they put on the battlefield when they casted that historic spell, but honestly, I see that as an interesting way of building this deck. You could go into a blink theme. There are a lot of ways you could abuse this deck. Obviously, you're casting a lot of historic spells, so any artifacts you're casting, any legendary creatures, or even sagas, for example, can be triggering this commander. So that way you can just kind of dump things into the graveyard, go into a little bit of a self-mill strategy, and then later on when you cast historic spells, you can put those on the battlefield. And like I mentioned previously with blink spells, because it has that ability, if it would leave the battlefield, exile instead of putting it anywhere else, blinking spells will actually override that because they are getting exiled themselves, but then they will return back on the battlefield. And of course, if they do have new ETBs entering the battlefield, you can take advantage of that as well. So I do feel like this card has some serious potential. I feel like I might want to build this deck myself. I honestly kind of convinced myself before I made this video. This is actually the whole reason why I wanted to make this video in the first place, was because of Moira and Tesar having that ability, and I feel like it's not really talked about enough. But I do want to focus on another commander called Gandalf Friend of the Shire. I feel like this is an excellent commander, especially in budget options too. My cousin actually has a deck around this, and it's surprisingly very good because it's a very tempo-y kind of deck. It does have flash itself, and you may cast sorcery spells, although they had flash too. And whenever the ring tempts you, if you choose a creature other than Gandalf, Friend of the Shire, as your ring bearer, you draw a card. So of course I do have to talk about the flavor of this card. I feel like the flavor is super on point, choosing another ring bearer other than Gandalf, kind of choosing Frodo in that way so that you could get advantage by drawing a card. But I feel like, honestly, having that flash ability is pretty flavorful too, because a wizard arrives precisely when he means to. But with this commander, it essentially is having that ability of giving your sorceries flash speed so that you can cast instant sorceries whenever you want. So again, it's a very tempo-y kind of card. My cousin actually built this around a mill strategy, and it's pretty powerful because you can cast things at any time that you want. I will also say there is a lot of Lord of the Rings cards in here. I didn't realize how much stuff I listed out in here that are going to be Lord of the Rings cards for the rest of the video, but there was a lot of commanders that came out of there, and so of course I wanted to briefly mention them. So let's stay in Middle-earth. Let's talk about King of the Oathbreakers. This is an excellent commander that I feel like wasn't really talked about enough in my opinion. So it is an Orzhov commander, it does have flying, and whenever it or another spirit you control becomes the target of a spell, it phases out. Whenever King of the Oathbreakers or another spirit you control phases in, you create a tapped 1/1 white spirit creature token with flying. So I will say the downside of this card is the fact that it's not a May ability. You have to phase it out if it does become targeted of spell. So if somebody does have a bounce spell, it'll just get phased out. But I mean, it's not completely a downside, it's just something that I want to mention briefly, but having the ability for them to phase back in and having more of an army coming out on the battlefield is pretty crazy. Of course, you can focus on a spirit theme, but honestly, this is a generator itself. If you have a lot of ways to target your spirits that are on the battlefield, the more you can generate later on. So honestly, this could be pretty powerful in the right type of situation, whether your opponents are targeting it or yourself are targeting the cards too, because you can target them yourself. So pretty much once this commander is on the battlefield, it is pretty hard to remove unless you have a board wipe that you can get rid of it, but in most scenarios, if you try to target this or another spirit on the battlefield, they're just going to phase out. So really, it's really hard to play around and play against. But next up, I do want to talk about the Wardens of Isengard with Merry and Pippin. I feel like these are a great combination together. They did come out of the Hobbit Precon deck, but I feel like they were overshadowed by some other commanders in there, but they are pretty powerful with each other, to be quite honest. I played a game against these guys, and honestly, they kind of blew us all out with the overrun ability with Pippin and having the ability to make more soldiers with Merry. So I'll be quite honest, I did overlook these commander pairings together, but again, I feel like these are very powerful at what they do, giving you a big army and also giving an overrun effect for the win con. Speaking of overrun, I do like Agatha of the V Cauldron. I don't think there's a lot of chatter around this commander. I do feel like the other witches that came out of Wilds of Eldraine maybe got a little more attention than Agatha. But I do like this because it really focuses on you having creatures with activated abilities. Plus, I do always forget this is just one red and a green for all that text. So this does read, activated abilities of creatures you control cost X less to activate, where X is Agatha of the Vile Cauldron's power. This effect can't reduce the mana and the cost to less than 1 mana. Plus herself has that ability of paying 4 red and a green. Other creatures you control get +1/+1 and gain trample and haste until end of turn. So her ability does feed into her activated ability. Unfortunately, she doesn't give herself the overrun effect. But if you do put an enchantment on Agatha of the Vile Cauldron, giving her like a +5/+5, making her a 6/6 on the battlefield, that could just be reduced to a red and a green in that cost instead of 4 red and a green. Plus, not to mention, she is an infinite mana outlet. You don't have to tap her to pay into that cost, and say for example, you just keep pumping into that effect, you could just give all your creatures +1,000,000/1,000,000, get trample and haste to win the game that way. So for me personally, I feel like Agatha of the Vile Cauldron is a pretty sweet commander overall, one that I feel like is very underrated in my opinion. But let's go back to March of the Machine. Let's talk about Zergo and Ojutai. For me personally, this was a really cool design space for dragons. It is in Jeskai colors, and it does have flying and haste, and it does have hexproof as long as it enters the battlefield this turn. Also, whenever one or more dragons you control deal combat damage to a player or a battle, look at the top 3 cards of your library. Put one of them into your hand and the rest on the bottom of your library in any order. You may return one of those dragons to its owner's hand. So when this first came out, I was actually really high on it, but I realized I was probably the only ones that were super high on Zergo and Ojutai, because this does feel like a really cool sneak attack commander, having that ability to return a dragon to your hand when they deal combat damage, so that you don't have to have them be sacrificed. You could reuse that sneak attack if you wanted to. I do know that is kind of limiting because there's only a couple sneak attack options in the format that are in red, like sneak attack and Perforos Bronze Blooded. But I will say this is pretty interesting, having that ability of whenever more dragons you control deal combat damage to a player or a battle, look at the top 3 cards of your library. So you do have 3 different opponents, you can get 3 different triggers off that. And say for example you have 2 other battles on the battlefield, you could potentially get 5 of those triggers off of dealing combat damage with one of your dragons you do have on the battlefield. Of course, that's just based off of this example of having 3 different players you're facing and 2 other battles you could be swinging into. Also, I do like the color combination of Jeskai. It's outside of your typical dragon tribal shell. Usually you're in Gruul colors, you're in Rakdos colors, you're in Jund colors, or you're even in Temur colors with Mirim. But with this, you're focusing on a couple different strategies with this Jeskai color combination, which I do really like. But for me personally, I kind of was surprised how unpopular this commander was. But I don't need to get into it too much. I do want to move on to my last one, and technically it is 4 because it came out of one set and not a lot of people might know about them. So I am referring to the Witch King Sky Scourge, Aragorn Hornburg Hero, Galadriel Light of Valinor, and Gandalf of the Secret Fire. So many people might not know these existed because these came out of a holiday launch for Lord of the Rings. They came out in these panorama arts, and so again, not a lot of people may know about these, but they're all unique cards that came out. But I will say all of these are really good in their own right. The Witch King Sky Scourge focuses on you having a lot of raids so that you can exile the top cards of your library so that you can play those cards, and also it does have Undying. Aragorn Hornburg Hero is an insane 1/1 counter commander. Galadriel Light of Valinor is a pretty insane card too, having that alliance ability, either giving you mana, putting 1/1 counter on each of your creatures, or scrying then drawing a card, all based off of the alliance effect. And of course with Gandalf of Secret Fire, it focuses on giving your spells suspend when you cast them. Obviously they do have 3 time counters on them. But again, the main reason why I wanted to focus on these is the fact that a lot of them may be be maybe unpopular. I feel like the Witch King may be the most unpopular out of this group, or Gandalf. I do feel like Aragorn is probably one of the better Aragorns I've seen, other than Aragorn the Uniter. But I do feel like also Galadriel may be very powerful in the right type of situation, because of course if you go into the elf theme, you have that ability to constantly put cards on the battlefield, get all those triggered abilities going for you. But again, to me personally, I feel like these were not talked about at all, like whatsoever. So again, I wanted to point these out mainly for presenting them to everybody, because again, I feel like nobody really discussed these when they were released. Maybe they did for like a quick second, but then they just kind of glanced over into the new set with either Lost Caverns of Ixalan or Wilds of Eldraine. I forgot which one of these were spoiled beforehand. But otherwise, very powerful commanders. But that is going to do it for me, guys. Thank you guys so much for coming by and watching this video on 10 underrated commanders, or commanders you may forgot about this year, because of course there were a lot of commanders to discuss. Let me know down below in the comments, what are your thoughts and opinions about these commanders? Is there any commanders that I missed that you feel like are deserving to be underrated? Let me know down below again in the comments. Make sure to like, share, and subscribe to the channel. And with that out of the way, thank you for stomping by.